The year was 2347, and humanity had spread far beyond the blue planet they once called home. Ships carried families across the black void of space. They built homes on distant moons and planets. They mined asteroids for precious metals. They studied alien life forms that grew in ice and fire. Humanity was no longer a species of one world. They were explorers. They were dreamers. They were survivors. On the frozen moon of Vega 4, there was a small outpost called Station 7. It was not a famous place. No one wrote songs about it. No one made movies about the people who lived there. It was just a tiny dot on a star map, a place where 2,400 people called home. Commander Jake stood at the window of the command center and looked out at the endless white plains of ice. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had served in the military for 30 years before taking this quiet posting. He thought he would finish his career here, watching over miners and scientists, filling out reports that no one would ever read. His security team had 32 members. They were good people, but they were not warriors. They handled bar fights and domestic disputes. They rescued workers who got lost in ice storms. They had never fired their weapons at an enemy. Jake hoped they never would. In the medical wing, Dr. Amy was finishing her research for the day. She was which meant she studied alien life. On Vega 4, that meant tiny organisms that lived deep in the ice. They were not intelligent. They were not dangerous, but they were proof that life could exist in the coldest and darkest places. Amy looked at the clock and smiled. Her son Danny would be waiting for her. He was 12 years old, with messy brown hair and his father's curious eyes. His father had died 3 years ago in a mining accident on another colony. Amy had brought Danny here to start fresh, to build a new life far from painful memories. Danny was in the recreation center, playing virtual games with his friends. He was a quiet boy who loved to read stories about space explorers and brave heroes. He dreamed of becoming a pilot someday, of flying his own ship through the stars. His mother worried about him, but Danny was stronger than she knew. The colony was a peaceful place. People worked hard during the day and gathered in the common areas at night. They shared meals and told stories. They celebrated birthdays and holidays. They complained about the cold and the food and the distance from Earth, but they were happy. They had built something together, a small piece of humanity in the vast darkness of space. None of them knew they were being watched. Far across the galaxy, in a system that human maps did not show, the Dominion held council. They were an ancient race, reptilian creatures with scales of deep green and eyes like burning coal. They had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 3,000 years. They had conquered dozens of species. They believed the stars belonged to them. High Warlord stood before the council, his massive form casting shadows across the chamber floor. He was the greatest military leader of his generation. He had burned worlds and broken armies. He had never known defeat. "The humans spread like disease," he said, his voice deep and cold. "They build their nests on worlds we have not yet claimed. They grow bolder with each passing cycle. If we do not act now, they will become a threat we cannot control." The council members murmured among themselves. Some were cautious. Humans were new to the galaxy, but they had shown strange resilience. Their technology advanced quickly. Their numbers grew faster than expected. "They are primitive," another warlord said. "They have been among the stars for only 3 centuries. We have ruled for 3,000 years. What threat can they pose?" Smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. "That is what makes this the perfect time to strike. We will teach them their place. We will show them that the galaxy has masters and humans are not among them." He presented his plan. They would not attack Earth. That would provoke a war they did not want. Instead, they would strike a small colony, a place of no military value. They would kill everyone there. They would broadcast the massacre across human communication channels. They would show humanity what happened to species that expanded without permission. The council debated for hours. Some argued for caution, others wanted larger targets, but in the end, his voice was the loudest. The vote was taken, the decision was made. Station 7 would burn. Back on Vega 4, life continued as normal. Jake approved supply requests and scheduled maintenance rotations. Amy wrote her research reports and made dinner for her son. Danny played games with his friends and dreamed of the stars. The ice plain stretched endlessly in all directions. The sky was dark, lit only by distant suns that looked like scattered diamonds. The wind howled across the frozen surface, carrying snow that had fallen a million years ago. In the command center, a young communications officer named Lisa Crane monitored the channels. She was 26 years old, fresh from training on Earth. This was her first posting, and she found it boring. Nothing ever happened on Vega 4. The most exciting event of the month was a malfunction in the heating system. She did not notice the faint signal at the edge of sensor range. It was small, barely more than static. By the time the sensors identified it as 3 incoming vessels, it was already too late. Jake was eating dinner in his quarters when the alarm sounded. He dropped his fork and ran to the command center. His heart was pounding. In 30 years of service, he had never heard that particular alarm. It meant unknown contacts. It meant potential hostiles. It meant that the peaceful life of Station 7 was about to end. He reached the command center and looked at the main screen. 3 ships hung in orbit above the moon. They were massive, covered in dark metal and strange symbols. They were not human. They were not any species that Jake recognized. "What are they?" he asked. Lisa Crane looked up at him with fear in her eyes. "I don't know, sir. They're not responding to our hails. They're just sitting there." Jake felt cold dread settle in his stomach. He had spent his whole career hopping for peace. He had told himself that humanity could expand into the galaxy without conflict. He had believed that the universe was big enough for everyone. He was wrong. The ships began to move. Weapons ports opened along their hulls. Energy gathered in their forward arrays. Jake grabbed the communication console and sent a distress signal to Earth. It would take 14 hours to arrive. Help would take even longer. He looked at the screen one last time. Then he looked at his people, at the scared faces of men and women who had never trained for war. "Sound the evacuation alarm," he said quietly. "Get everyone to the shelters, now." The first blast hit 3 seconds later. The first blast tore through the eastern dome like paper. Glass and metal exploded inward. Bodies flew through the air. Screams filled the communication channels, mixing with static and the roar of destruction. Jake grabbed the edge of the console as the ground shook beneath his feet. Emergency lights flashed red across the command center. Alarms screamed from every direction. On the main screen, he watched the second and third blasts strike the residential sectors. "Get me a damage report," he shouted over the noise. Lisa Crane's hands were shaking as she worked the controls. "Domes 3 and 4 are gone. We've lost contact with sectors 7 through 12. Casualty estimates are—" She stopped. Her face went pale. "Sir, we've lost hundreds already." Jake closed his eyes for just a moment. He thought of all the families in those sectors, the children, the workers who had come here for a better life, gone in seconds. But he could not grieve yet. There were still people alive. There were still people he could save. "All security teams to the shelters," he ordered. "Protect the civilians. That's our only priority now." Across the colony, chaos spread like wildfire. People ran through corridors that filled with smoke and debris. Parents searched for children. Workers tried to seal breaches in the walls. The cold air of Vega 4 rushed through broken domes, freezing everything it touched. In the medical wing, Amy felt the floor shake and knew something terrible had happened. She grabbed her coat and ran toward the recreation center where Danny had been playing. The corridors were crowded with panicked people pushing in all directions. "Danny," she screamed. "Danny." She found him huddled behind an overturned table with two other children. His face was white with fear, but he was alive. She grabbed him and held him tight, feeling his small body tremble against hers. "Mom, what's happening?" he asked. "I don't know, baby, but we have to move. We have to get to the shelters." They ran through smoke-filled hallways. The lights flickered and died. Emergency strips on the floor glowed faint blue, showing the path to safety. Amy held Danny's hand and did not let go. But the shelters were not safe. Nothing was safe. The landing ships descended through the thin atmosphere of Vega 4. Their hulls were black, covered in symbols that meant death in a language humanity had never known. The ships touched down on the ice plains around the colony, and their doors opened. Soldiers poured out by the hundreds. They were tall creatures, covered in dark scales that reflected the distant starlight. Their eyes burned with cold purpose. They carried weapons that glowed with strange energy. They did not come to conquer. They did not come to negotiate. They came to kill. The first wave of soldiers breached the colony walls within minutes. They moved through the corridors with terrible efficiency, shooting everything that moved. Men, women, children. It did not matter. They did not see humans as people. They saw them as pests to be exterminated. Jake and his security team made their stand at the central hub. They had 32 people against hundreds of enemy soldiers. They knew they could not win, but they could buy time. They could give the civilians a chance to hide. "Hold the line," Jake shouted as energy blasts filled the air around him. His people fought bravely. They fought harder than they had ever been trained to fight. But one by one, they fell. Jake watched his friends die beside him. He watched young men and women who had never wanted to be soldiers give their lives for strangers. When the finally broke through, Jake was the last one standing. He had taken 3 wounds that should have killed him. His weapon was empty. His legs could barely hold him up. A commander approached him slowly. The creature was massive, towering over Jake by nearly a foot. Its eyes studied him with cold curiosity. "You fight well for vermin," the commander said in broken human language, "but your fighting is done." Jake spat blood on the floor. "More will come. You don't know what you've started." The commander laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "We know exactly what we have started, a lesson. Your kind will learn to fear or you will join these dead." The commander raised his weapon and fired. Jake fell, and the last defender of Station 7 was gone. Deep in the maintenance tunnels beneath the colony, Amy pressed her hand over Danny's mouth to keep him quiet. They could hear the sounds above them: screams, weapons fire, heavy footsteps. They were not alone in the tunnels. A dozen survivors had found their way down here. Lisa Crane was among them, clutching a recording device to her chest. She had been documenting everything since the attack began. She did not know why. She just knew that someone had to witness this. Someone had to remember. For 3 days, the survivors hid in the darkness. They heard the searching above them. They heard the executions. They heard the silence that followed. Amy held Danny close and whispered stories to him. Stories about Earth and blue skies and oceans that stretched forever. She told him about heroes who faced impossible odds and never gave up. She told him that help was coming. She told him that everything would be okay. She did not believe her own words, but she needed Danny to believe them. On the 3rd day, the sounds above them stopped. They were leaving. Lisa Crane climbed up through a maintenance hatch to see what remained. The colony was destroyed. Bodies lay everywhere, frozen in the cold air that now filled every dome. The buildings were burned and broken. The ice plains were stained with dark marks from plasma weapons. And in the center of the colony, carved into the frozen ground with burning energy, were words in human language. "Know your masters." Lisa fell to her knees and cried. She cried for the dead. She cried for the survivors. She cried for humanity, which had just learned that they were not alone in the universe, and that some of their neighbors wanted them dead. She lifted her recording device with trembling hands. She had captured everything. The attack, the massacre, the final message. She did not know if anyone would ever see it, but she pressed the transmit button anyway, sending the files into space toward Earth. 14 hours later, the signal reached home. In the tunnels below, Amy and Danny waited with the other survivors. There were 16 of them in total, 16 out of 2,400. They had no food, they had little water, they had no weapons. But they were alive, and as long as they were alive, there was hope. Danny looked up at his mother with eyes that had seen too much. "Mom," he whispered, "will they come back?" Amy stroked his hair gently. "I don't know, baby." "What will happen now?" Amy thought about Earth. She thought about the billions of humans who would soon learn what had happened here. She thought about the military fleets and the weapons that humanity had built but never used. "Now," she said quietly, "Earth will answer." She did not know how right she was. The signal from Station 7 arrived at Earth Defense Command at 3:47 in the morning. A young analyst named Park was the first to see it. He had been half asleep at his station, drinking cold coffee and watching routine traffic reports. Then his screen lit up with emergency codes he had never seen outside of training simulations. He opened the files and began to watch. Within 30 seconds, his coffee cup had fallen from his hand. Within 2 minutes, he was running to wake his commanding officer. Within 10 minutes, the highest levels of Earth's government were being pulled from their beds. Admiral Sam arrived at Defense Command at 4:30 in the morning. He was 62 years old, with silver hair and a face carved by decades of service. He had commanded ships in border skirmishes and peacekeeping missions. He had never commanded in a real war. Neither had anyone else alive. He sat in the briefing room and watched the footage in complete silence. He watched the ships arrive. He watched the bombardment. He watched the ground assault. He watched the executions. He watched 2,387 human beings die. When the footage ended, he sat very still for a long moment. His hands rested on the table in front of him. His face showed no emotion. But inside, something very old and very dangerous was waking up. President Cole arrived an hour later. She was a former soldier herself, a woman who had served 2 tours in the Mars conflicts before entering politics. She had gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen their share of violence. She watched the same footage. She asked no questions. When it was over, she looked at Admiral. "What do we know about them?" she asked. "They call themselves the Dominion," replied. "Our intelligence is limited. They control approximately 40 star systems. They have been a spacefaring civilization for roughly 3,000 years. They have conquered or destroyed at least a dozen other species. And they attacked us because they see us as a threat, or perhaps just as an annoyance. The message they left suggests they want us to know our place." President Cole nodded slowly. "Our place?" "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but carried an edge of steel. "Assemble the Security Council. Full emergency session. Every member, no exceptions." The United Nations Security Council met 6 hours later in a sealed chamber beneath Geneva. Representatives from every nation on Earth sat around the circular table. They had all seen the footage. They had all felt the same cold fury. There were no arguments. There were no debates about proportional response or diplomatic solutions. For the first time in human history, every nation on Earth agreed on something completely and without reservation. Resolution 7741 was introduced, debated for exactly 7 minutes, and passed by unanimous vote. It authorized total military retaliation against the Dominion. It released all restrictions on weapons deployment. It committed every available warship to a single purpose: vengeance. Admiral stood before the council after the vote. "I want to be clear about what this means," he said. "We are not talking about a limited strike. We are not talking about negotiation or surrender terms. If we do this, we do it completely. They wanted to teach us fear. We will teach them extinction. No one objected. The fleet assembled at Luna Station over the following week. Ships came from every corner of human space. Mining vessels were converted to carriers. Research ships were fitted with weapons. Private corporations donated their fastest transports. Retired officers came out of hiding to serve once more. By the end of the week, Admiral commanded 847 warships. It was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. At its center was the newly commissioned Dreadnought-class vessel Reckoning. It was 2 kilometers long, bristling with weapons that had never been tested in combat. Some of those weapons were so destructive that they had been built only as deterrents, meant to ensure that no enemy would ever dare attack humanity. That calculation had failed. Now those weapons would be used. Captain Ben Torres stood on the bridge of the Reckoning and studied the fleet forming around him. He was 44 years old, a quiet man with dark eyes and steady hands. He had spent his career in patrol squadrons, never expecting to command anything larger than a frigate. Now he commanded the most powerful warship ever built. His wife Corinne had cried when he told her about the assignment. Their daughter was only 6 years old. She did not understand where Daddy was going or why. Ben had held them both for a long time before leaving. He did not know if he would see them again, but he knew that if he did not go, if humanity did not answer this attack, then no child anywhere would ever be safe. The fleet departed Luna Station on a cold Tuesday morning. Ships formed up in perfect lines, their engines glowing blue against the darkness of space. They moved toward the edge of the solar system, toward the hyperspace jump points that would carry them across the galaxy. On every ship, crews prepared for what was coming. They checked weapons and ran combat drills. They wrote letters to families they might never see again. They prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Admiral addressed the fleet before the jump. His voice carried across every ship, reaching the ears of nearly 200,000 men and women. 3 weeks ago, our people were murdered, he said. Children were killed in their beds. Families were torn apart. And when it was over, the enemy carved a message into the ground. They wanted us to know our masters. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice was harder than stone. Today, we answer that message. We do not go to negotiate. We do not go to capture territory. We go to show the galaxy what happens when you touch our people. They wanted us to know fear. We will teach them its true meaning. The fleet jumped into hyperspace. 847 ships vanished from human space in a flash of light, carrying with them the full fury of a species that had been pushed too far. The Dominion had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 3,000 years. They had conquered species and burned worlds. They believed they were the masters of all they surveyed. They were about to learn that some prey bites back. And when humanity bites, it bites hard enough to break worlds. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of space like a swarm of angry hornets. They did not announce themselves. They did not send demands or ultimatums. They simply began to move, spreading across the enemy's territory with cold purpose. High Warlord received the first reports with disbelief. Human ships had been detected in 3 separate systems. They were not probing defenses or gathering intelligence. They were attacking. How many ships? He demanded. His subordinate hesitated before answering. Our scouts estimate over 800 vessels, Warlord. Felt something he had not experienced in decades: uncertainty. The humans had barely 300 years of spacefaring history. They should not have been able to assemble such a force. They should have cowered and begged for mercy after the lesson at station. Send the 3rd Fleet to intercept, he ordered. Destroy them before they can cause any real damage. But the humans did not fight like any enemy that had faced before. Captain Ben Torres led the first strike against Prime, the agricultural heart of the Dominion. The planet was covered in farms and processing facilities that fed dozens of colonies. It had almost no military defenses. Why would it? No enemy had ever penetrated this deep into territory. The Reckoning dropped out of hyperspace directly above the planet. Its weapons began firing before the orbital stations could even raise shields. Within minutes, the stations were debris. Within hours, the bombardment of the surface began. Every farm, every processing plant, every food storage depot. Tors gave the orders with a steady voice and watched through sensors as fire rained down on the planet below. He thought about the children at station. He thought about the message carved into the frozen ground. When the Reckoning departed 12 hours later, Prime was a burning ruin. 12 billion faced starvation. Tors felt nothing, not satisfaction, not guilt, nothing at all. He had become something he never wanted to be, but they had made him this way. They had chosen this. Across space, the pattern repeated. Human ships struck without warning, targeting not military installations but infrastructure, power plants, communication hubs, water purification systems. The humans were not trying to defeat the military. They were trying to break the civilization. Lieutenant Commander Price led a covert team to Station, the largest shipyard in the Dominion. She was 31 years old, a demolitions expert who had spent 10 years training for missions she hoped would never happen. Now she found herself commanding 20 soldiers on a suicide run into the heart of enemy territory. They approached the station in a captured shuttle, transmitting stolen codes. Security challenged them twice. Both times, the codes worked. Price felt sweat running down her back as they docked at a maintenance port. Her team moved through the station like ghosts. They planted nuclear charges in the reactor cores. They set timers for exactly 90 minutes. Then they ran. They almost made it. A patrol spotted them 3 minutes before detonation. Weapons fire filled the corridor. Price took a hit to her shoulder but kept running. 2 of her soldiers fell and did not get up. The shuttle launched just as the first charge detonated. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. One by one, the station's reactors went critical. The largest shipyard in the Dominion, capable of building 100 warships per cycle, vanished in a flash of light that could be seen from 3 systems away. Price watched through the shuttle's window as the fireball expanded. 60% of the enemy's naval construction capacity, gone in an instant. She thought about the friends she had lost on the station. She thought about the workers who had died, most of them probably civilians who had nothing to do with the attack on. She pushed the thought away. This was war. They had started it. Humanity would finish it. The Third Fleet finally caught up with the human forces at the Battle of Nexus Point. Admiral had been waiting for them. He had studied tactics, their formations, their communication patterns. He knew exactly how they would attack. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the Third Fleet no longer existed. Human losses were minimal. They had never faced an enemy that adapted so quickly, that learned from every engagement, that seemed to know what they were going to do before they did it. High Warlord stared at the casualty reports with growing horror. His empire was burning, his fleets were being destroyed, and the humans showed no sign of stopping. He called an emergency meeting of the Dominion Council. "We must sue for peace," he said. "We must offer them whatever they want, territory, resources, tribute, anything." An elder counselor shook his head slowly. "You do not understand, Warlord. You attacked their young. You killed their children. Among humans there is no crime greater than this. They will not stop until we are destroyed." "That is madness. Surely they can be reasoned with." "You carved your reasoning into their frozen moon. Did you think they would forget?" Sent envoys to the human fleet. The first envoy was sent back with a single message, footage from Station 7. The second envoy was destroyed before it could transmit. The third was simply ignored. Admiral would not negotiate. Captain Tors would not negotiate. No human would negotiate. The fleet continued its advance, burning a path through space toward their ultimate destination, Prime, the of the Dominion. 14 billion lived there. 3,000 years of history and culture called it home. His remaining forces for a final defense. Every ship, every soldier, every resource that remained was pulled back to protect the. It was the largest defensive formation in history. He believed it would be enough. He believed the humans would see the gathered might of the Dominion and finally understand that total victory was impossible. He believed they would accept a peace that left both sides wounded but alive. He was wrong about all of it. The human fleet arrived at Prime on a day that would be remembered forever. They emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, 847 ships arranged in a sphere around the planet. At their center, the reckoning hung like a dark promise. Captain Torres looked at the defensive fleet on his sensors. Thousands of ships, more than twice his numbers. It should have been overwhelming. He smiled for the first time in weeks. All ships begin attack pattern Alpha. Let's finish this. The Battle of Prime began. The Battle of Prime lasted 9 hours. It was the largest space battle in the history of the galaxy. Thousands of ships filled the void around the planet, their weapons painting the darkness with fire and light. They fought with everything they had. They threw wave after wave of ships at the human fleet. They launched fighters and bombers. They fired weapons that had destroyed entire civilizations before. For the first time in their long history, they fought not for conquest but for survival. It was not enough. Captain Torres commanded the reckoning from the center of the battle. His voice remained calm as he issued orders, coordinating hundreds of ships with the precision of a master chess player. He had studied tactics for months. He knew their patterns, their weaknesses, their blind spots. Human ships moved like dancers, slipping through enemy formations and striking at critical points. They did not fight with honor or tradition. They fought with cold efficiency, using every trick and tactic that centuries of human warfare had developed. They had never faced anything like it. High Warlord watched from his flagship as his fleet crumbled around him. Ships that had ruled the stars for generations were torn apart by human weapons. Warriors who had never known defeat died by the thousands. "Fight harder," he screamed at his commanders. "We are the masters of this galaxy. We cannot fall to these creatures." But the humans kept coming. They absorbed losses that should have broken any fleet. They adapted to every strategy within minutes. They seemed to know that time was their ally, that every hour of battle weakened the defenders while fresh human ships arrived from hyperspace. 6 hours into the battle, the defensive line broke. Human ships poured through the gap, surrounding the remaining enemy vessels. Admiral gave the order for all ships to surrender. Most of them did. They had no choice. Their fleet was shattered, their exposed, their warlord captured when human marines boarded his flagship, was brought before Admiral in chains, his proud scales scratched and dull. "You have won," said. "Name your terms, we will accept any peace you offer." Admiral looked at him for a long moment. "Station 7 could not surrender," he said quietly. "Neither can you." Felt fear for the first time in his life. "What are you going to do?" Did not answer. He simply turned and walked away. The reckoning moved into position above Prime. Below, 14 billion looked up at the dark shape that blotted out their sun. They had heard the reports from the battle. They knew their fleet was destroyed. But surely, they thought, surely the humans would not harm civilians. Surely there were limits to revenge. They did not understand what they had awakened. Deep within the reckoning, Captain Torres stood before a console that controlled weapons humanity had hoped would never be used. Matter disruption warheads, designed to destabilize a planet's core. They had been built as a deterrent, a weapon so terrible that no enemy would ever dare attack humanity. That theory had been tested at Station 7. It had failed. Torres looked at the console. His hands did not shake. His heart did not race. He thought about the children who died in their beds. He thought about Dr. Amy hiding in the tunnels with her son. He thought about Commander Jake making his last stand against impossible odds. Admiral's voice came through the communication system. "Captain Torres, you may proceed." Torres pressed the button. The first warhead struck Prime's northern hemisphere. It penetrated the crust and detonated deep within the planet's mantle. The explosion was invisible from space, but its effects were immediate. Earthquakes rippled across continents. Volcanoes that had been dormant for millions of years erupted. The second warhead struck the south, then the third, then the fourth. Within 12 hours, the planet's crust began to fracture. Massive cracks spread across continents. Oceans boiled into steam. Cities that had stood for thousands of years collapsed into rivers of molten rock. Within 48 hours, Prime was gone. Where an ancient world had circled its sun, there was now only an expanding field of debris. 14 billion, along with 3,000 years of history and culture, had been erased from existence. The surviving colonies received a single broadcast. It showed the footage from Station 7, the attack, the massacre, the message carved into the ice. Then it showed the destruction of Prime, the warheads falling, the planet breaking apart, the final silence. There was no commentary, no demands, no threats. The message was clear enough. In the weeks that followed, colonies surrendered one by one. Their government collapsed. Their military dissolved. Some colonies begged for mercy. Others simply went quiet, their populations too shocked to respond. Admiral accepted their surrenders without comment. He took no territory. He demanded no tribute. He simply documented each surrender and moved on. The human fleet returned home in silence, their mission complete. Back on Vega 4, a rescue team finally reached the survivors of Station 7. 16 people emerged from the tunnels beneath the ruined colony. Among them was a 12-year-old boy named Danny, holding his mother's hand. They were brought to Earth as heroes, though none of them felt heroic. Amy gave testimony to the Security Council about what had happened. Lisa Crane handed over her recordings. Danny said nothing at all. He had not spoken a word since the attack. Captain Torres retired from the military after the campaign. He returned to Earth and tried to live a normal life with his wife Corinne and their daughter. But he woke up screaming most nights, haunted by the 14 billion deaths he had ordered. When he heard about young Danny, he and Corinne made a decision. They adopted the boy. They gave him a home, a family, a chance to heal. Torres never spoke to Danny about what had happened. He never tried to explain or justify. He simply tried to be there to help the boy find his way back to light. The galaxy watched humanity with new eyes. Ambassadors from species across known space arrived at Earth, seeking treaties and alliances. Some came out of respect. Others came out of fear. All of them wanted to understand the species that had answered an atrocity with extinction. A diplomat from the consortium, a federation of peaceful trading species, asked Admiral a question that echoed across the galaxy. How could you do it? How could you destroy an entire world? Looked at the diplomat for a long moment. His face showed no pride, no shame, no regret, just exhaustion. You saw what they did to our children, he said simply. What did you think would happen? The diplomat had no answer. Humanity returned to their colonies, their research, their peaceful expansion. They rebuilt Station 7 as a memorial. They smiled at their neighbors and traded fairly. They helped species in need and explored the unknown with wonder and courage. But across the galaxy, every species remembered what lay beneath that smile. They remembered Prime. They remembered the human fleet hanging in the void like a dark promise. They remembered the silence that followed. A new phrase entered the languages of every spacefaring civilization: never wake the sleeping giant. In his new home on Earth, Danny began to speak again. He started slowly, just a few words at a time. He went to school. He made friends. He learned to smile again. One night he asked Captain Tors why humans had done what they did, why they had destroyed an entire world. Tors thought for a long time before answering. "Because you survived," he said quietly. "Because as long as children like you are alive, humanity will protect them, no matter the cost, no matter what we have to become." Danny nodded slowly. He did not fully understand, but someday he would. And the galaxy would never forget.